periodic change of players, but a fundamental change in the rules of the game. I repeat, what India needs today is not merely periodic change of players, but a fundamental change in the rules of the game. In order to translate his vision into Lok Satta and Vote India movements, we are proud to say that he is an old student of Andhra Loyola College and stayed in this very hostel for his intermediate. May request Reverend Father Norbert, Jesuit dedication.
And they started asking me questions. One questioner asked him, "Bishop, what do you think of the red light areas of New York City?" Now the poor bishop was quite embarrassed, and he thought he should tactfully avoid this question. He said, "Are there red light areas in this city?" Next morning there was a newspaper headline, "Bishop inquires about red light districts." I am now in the exact opposite position, dealing with Jesuit priests, trying to look at what has to be done in the next 25 or 30 years in terms of building a society, a new society of which we can all be justly proud. 2,500 years ago, a disciple of Socrates had a difficult problem. He stood up one day and asked the master, he said, "Master, for 20 years, I sat here patiently when you and my colleagues were discussing a number of issues. Never once did I open my mouth. Was it right or was it wrong not to have opened the mouth?" Socrates, the great philosopher that he was, he gave an answer that was at once universal, applicable to all human beings in all ages. He said, "Young man, if you are a wise man, then you were a fool. If you are a fool, then you are a wise man." It took me also some time to decipher the meaning of that very profound statement. He meant to say that if you are a wise man whose wisdom could have consequences to the well-being of those around you, then you were a fool in having concealed your wisdom by not talking. But if you are a fool anyway, if what you say is of no consequence to the fellow human beings, then you are a very wise man in having concealed your ignorance. Let me therefore conceal my ignorance and say a few things and leave some time for interaction. If we want to look at the society of the future, tomorrow's society, I believe we must look at the purpose of life. The question that all of you, the men and women of religion, have been addressing throughout the ages. Now, I'm not a man of religion. Father Thakamari and I had debates in those days, and as a very intrepid youngster, I questioned the existence of God, and he was very, very kind and very tolerant, otherwise he would knock me out of the room. We debated that endlessly. Even now, I do not know if there's a God. The loss is entirely mine. But independent of that, irrespective of that, is there a purpose in life? Can we discover a purpose? What is life about? And if we understand that, I think organizing society around those central principles would be relatively easy. And if we understand how society should be built, then rebuilding education, restructuring education, will be then the natural consequence. Therefore, let me start off with that somewhat profound philosophical question. What is the purpose of life? In a non-religious manner, independent of religion and God. Let me present before you very humbly a hypothesis. The first purpose of any living being, not merely human beings, plants and animals, from virus to the gargantuan creatures, is to survive. It doesn't require a genius. We all want to survive. Almost all our instincts are centered around this need, this urge, this yearning for survival. But that's not enough. We want something more than individual survival. That's why even this desire to build tomorrow's society is because you want to perpetuate the species. If it's merely our survival, then why should we care for society of tomorrow? So the second element of survival is the survival of the species, the individual and the species. And that's why there is a procreative instinct. That's why there's a concern for tomorrow. That's why there is an enormous amount of churning going on all the time. And that's why, in evolutionary terms, not only biologically but socially and technologically, we are getting better and better because we want to make a better tomorrow possible. And that's why every generation is appearing to be taller than its predecessor generations, not because they are moral giants or intellectually superior, but because they stand on the shoulders of their predecessors. And therefore they are the benefit of the earlier generation, and what little they acquire is enough to make them a shade taller than their predecessors. So survival of the individual and the species. The second is harmony. As human beings, we need something more than mere survival, because if survival is the only principle that sustains us, then we are no better than human beings, than animals and plants. We require harmony. In nature, in plant kingdom and animals, harmony may be there, but it's not out of design, it's not out of volition. But as human beings, we recognize the need for harmony. Again, two kinds of harmony. The first in society, because man, the woman included, is a uniquely social animal. Man requires to interact because language, which is the gift that nature gave human beings uniquely, makes us extraordinarily strong because we can communicate, we can teach, we can learn, we can collaborate, we can cooperate, we can work in teams. And that's what made prosperity and progress on a scale unimaginable possible. When the first human beings learned language, many evolutionary biologists say it was probably about 30,000 years ago. Suddenly, there was proliferation of thought. Suddenly, there was creativity flourishing. All these great paintings and other things that you see, the cave paintings 30,000 years ago, they were all products of language. The moment language came, everything else came. Suddenly, the tools became better. Suddenly, human beings were far superior to other animals. But that also meant that we had to communicate to be able to work better. Therefore, society had to evolve in a unique way, not merely for collective survival as animals do, as animal herds do, but with the capacity to communicate, to interact, to collaborate, to cooperate. Therefore, harmony in society is a prerequisite for a sane society. But this harmony in society alone is not enough. If we all are harmonious but live in concrete jungles, not one of us would be happy. Even indoors, we have to have these plants, we have to have that greenery, we have to live in the midst of nature. Harmony in nature. We instinctively realize, now of course intellectually also we recognize that nature is very important and we cannot survive without nature. But even if that understanding was not there, nor was it necessary 1,000 years ago, people instinctively lived in harmony with nature, because human beings recognized that if they were divorced from nature, their lives would be much less valuable. My definition of boredom is the distance between you and nature. The farther we are from nature, the more bored we are. Only in this generation, the 2-year-old kids are saying, 3-year-old kids are saying, I am bored. I don't think 50 years ago, a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old kid ever said, I am bored. Only now, for the first time, toddlers are saying, we are bored. That is the degree of distance that we strayed from nature. Therefore, harmony in society and in nature, both. But even that is not enough. We yearn for something more. We yearn for freedom. For want of a better word, we could use any number of other words. I would leave out the spiritual domain, because that is your domain, but there are two other freedoms all of us seek. One is the obvious political freedom, the right to speak out, to express. Even if they're heterodox doctrines and opinions, throughout history, human beings always yearn for this right to speak, to differ, to disagree, to contest, to challenge. The political freedom, again, doesn't require much explanation. But there's another freedom, the intellectual freedom required. Nature endowed all of us with certain innate potential. But if the intellect is not allowed to flourish, to flower, then that potential is unfulfilled. And we all want to explore those possibilities. We all want to indulge in intellectual athleticism. Without that, the freedom is not complete. If you're trapped in your own mind, if there's no expression for that, if there are no opportunities for intellectual fulfillment, then that life is simply unhappy. They may not even be aware of that, because if you're steeped in complete ignorance, you may not even be aware that there's something that is missing, though there is some subconscious recognition. There may not be explicit awareness of that. But anybody who has seen intellectual freedom and experienced it would never like to go back to ignorance. So freedom of both kinds. I would say life is about enhancing these three: the survival of the individual and the species, promoting harmony in society and in nature, enhancing freedom of the political kind and of the intellectual kind. And the kind is an extension of that, a higher form of that. In addition, I may or may not be able to recognize the presence of God. But even I, an agnostic, do recognize that there is something like sin. And to me, there are two great sins. The first great sin is the unfulfilled potential. Every living being is endowed with great potential. A small little seed embeds in itself the enormous potential for growth, if only the conditions for that growth are fulfilled, if only that seed is properly nurtured, if only what nature ordained is allowed to give expression by circumstances, by nurture. In human beings too, there is that enormous potential at birth, irrespective of caste, creed, region, religion, language, skin color, and every other conceivable, artificial, narrow domestic wall that you can think of. But if that potential is not fulfilled, merely because the society is not organized properly to be able to tap that potential, then to me, that is a great sin. Sin against all humanity, sin against our own progeny, sin against society. The second great sin, to me, is avoidable suffering. There is much suffering that is unavoidable. There's nothing we can do about it except grieve. After a certain age, the flesh has to wither away. We all have to leave this world. There's no choice. There's no exception. If we lose our near and dear ones, they may be grief for some time, but we can't do much about it. And in my more irreverent moments, I actually believe that if that release is not there, if people live forever, the world would be unbearable. We would have unlimited number of pompous asses telling us what is right, what is wrong, never explore. And this country already has too many pompous asses. Death is a good thing when it comes in a timely manner. But there are other forms of unavoidable sufferings. Untimely death. You see a 7-year-old child with retinoblastoma of the eye, and you know the child dies, and the child has committed no grave sin. Child is innocence personified, purity personified, but you can't do anything about it. Nature simply ordained that child to die. There's nothing we can do about it. Old age, the suffering that comes with old age, the pains and the aches and the slow loss of memory and the fading talents and abilities, again, unhappy. But as we all grow old, we realize that even at 30, you're no longer as sprightly and as capable as you were at 20. And of course, at 50, we recognize many more problems. At 70, more so. It's inevitable again. There's nothing much we can do about it. We can delay it a little bit by a bit more discipline, but that's about it. These we need not bother about too much. But if the suffering is fully avoidable and yet we suffer, to me, that is a sin. Until a few years ago, every day in this country, 1,000 young kids, they fell prey to poliomyelitis, a fully preventable disease, a fully preventable disease. Even now when many of us go to villages, we find 40, 50, 60 young men and women who are paralyzed because of poliomyelitis. Only last few years, things have improved significantly, but even now in parts of India, notably the parts represented by the mighty leaders of India, I was telling Mrs. Sonia Gandhi the other day, that the two constituencies in India where poliomyelitis still exists are represented by herself, Sonia Gandhi, and Vajpayee. It's in many ways symptomatic of the way our society is structured, that power is completely divorced from public good, that tens of thousands of young men and women even today suffer from diseases that they have no business to suffer from in this day and age. It may be a dengue fever that's afflicting now tens of thousands across the country. It may be chikungunya, afflicting millions across the country. Fully preventable disease if only you control malaria and mosquito. You can control many of these diseases from malaria to dengue fever. And yet we have these problems. We can go on and on. The avoidable suffering. If you consider a society sinful on the basis of the sum total of unfulfilled potential and avoidable suffering in that society, then I should say regretfully that India bears the greatest burden of sin in the world. It's a brutal, but I think a necessary recognition of the magnitude of our failure. And that failure is entirely societal. It's not because of nature. It's not because of a God, whether he exists or not. It's because of us as a society. If we broadly agree with this hypothesis, then restructuring society, building tomorrow's society can be considered much more easily because we know what is it that we should allow to happen. What is it we are obstructing? What is it we are creating hurdles for? In what way are we underperforming? In what way are we allowing a lot of suffering to surface? So let me therefore list a few issues around which the whole society and as a part of that our educational edifice can be structured. And then I'll conclude, then we can have some meaningful interaction. I don't think I have anything very profound to say, nor anything elaborate to say, and to men and women of your quality and experience, saying too much would be extremely foolhardy. An advocate was once told by a very distinguished jurist, he said, "Young man, many an advocate has lost his case by not knowing when to stop." So I will stop as early as possible. I don't want to lose the case. So in designing, look at education per se, a field with which you're all deeply and intimately connected for decades. For saying so, but the purpose of education in this country increasingly appears to be churning out, like in a factory you churn out matchboxes, churning out these products. And the only quality test is a wretched examination. And the only way you pass the examination is mug up 3 years question papers as proved in the last year. because nobody in the right mind asked the questions on the last year's paper. So mug up the 3 preceding year's question papers in various guides, whether GVS or Spectrum or all sorts of guides I'm told about, and you get a first class, and education is complete. Not only is it disgraceful for the process of education, which is about the flowering of the human being, it's also dysfunctional to our society and to our economy. Because most of these young men and women are not only unemployed, but they're utterly unemployable, because they have no employable skills. And that's why we have in India a grand spectacle of 70% of engineering graduates who are unemployed. And they are more than happy to get a 3,000 rupees a month job after an engineering degree. Nowhere on earth do you see this. We claim that there are 700,000 young men and women every year passing out of engineering and technology institutions and science and technology in India, the world's largest number. But education, at a very fundamental level, of empowering these kids, of enabling them to be wealth creators, of giving them skills, employable skills, and of course, of making them into fine human beings. That's even a grander failure. It has failed spectacularly. We have to revisit this, and it's getting worse. Usually, things get better. Even if we never reach the level of perfection that we desire, we get better, and that's what human evolution is about. But in education, and I'm not saying this merely because I belong to already an earlier generation, but I think in education there's objective evidence to suggest that there's actually a decline. This very institution and many great institutions like that 30, 40 years ago were great institutions of intellectual quest, a spirit of inquiry, of making full-blown citizens, making worthy human beings. Now such institutions increasingly are becoming less and less important. During intermediate, when I joined this college in 1969, the best and the brightest came to this college from all over the state. They sought admission here. They felt it was a matter of privilege. They spent endless hours in the college laboratories because they thought doing things by practice, let alone the grand issues of intellectual flowering, of personality development, but even knowledge. They thought that quest for knowledge can be fulfilled only when you actually do things and you think and explore and discuss and debate. Today, you created huge factories in the name of residential coaching centers. These kids they start their work at 4:30 in the morning. A niece of mine is in one such institution right now. She met me this morning. She starts her work at 4:30 in the morning. She ends at 11:30 in the night. And she has no life except mugging up those questions and preparing for those examinations, preparing for the MSET tests, and getting admission to the medicine or engineering or whatever she's aspiring for. There's a huge problem. Not only is the personality stunted, but even the skills are not developed. If at least skills are developed, if the economy grows, if they become partners in wealth creation, I can say, all right, I can take care of personality tomorrow, but at least they are worthy partners in the economy. It's not true. 80% of youngsters have no real future unless we transform education and skill development. Healthcare. Much of the avoidable suffering is on account of failure of healthcare. For the elites in our society, the only purpose of healthcare and increasingly education is to differentiate our kids from the other kids, to give us opportunities in the market for our kids, so that I become the healthcare provider, I become the hospital manager, I become the hospital entrepreneur, and I make money at the cost of other people, but not guarantee health for the people. Not ensure education for every single child in the country. 58 years ago, in Britain, in the aftermath of the Second World War, when the country was economically in ruins, physically devastated, though it won the war, the elites decided that every single family should have quality health care at zero cost, out of pocket. Because in the middle of the 20th century, after the Second World War, The capacity to make that happen existed. They recognized it. By the time education became universal, but not health care, the Labour government said, we shall accomplish this. Anirudh Biwan, the then health minister in the Labour government, and his colleagues labored day and night, worked very hard, and built a healthcare system of which they could be justly proud even today, one of the finest in the world. Anirudh Biwan, every day, used to labor from morning to night, come home at about 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the night, weary, and used to have a quick supper late night, and then walk up wearily up the steps to his room with a briefcase load of papers, even at that time. One day he was carrying not one but two briefcase loads of books and papers. After his dinner, he was going up, and his wife standing downstairs, his long-suffering wife, she said, Anirudh, it's bad enough to take one to bed every night, but it's positively immoral to take two to bed. And that was the kind of agony they endured to build an enduring system which was just, which avoided this avoidable suffering. And even today, in 2006, the elites of India, despite our economic prosperity, relatively speaking, much better than Britain had in 1945, despite our technological capability, which is far superior to what Britain had at the time, the elites do not think even for a moment that every single Indian is entitled to decent health care without out-of-pocket expenditure. That if we don't do that, if we don't remove that avoidable suffering, then our lives are not worth it and our society is not well ordered. In tomorrow's society, and not 20 years later, but I'm saying 2 years later, 3 years later, we must guarantee good health, irrespective of the economic status of every single human being. We are capable of doing that. We have the money, we have the technology. Do we have the will? Do we have the managerial skill? Do we have the societal structuring capability? That's the challenge we must pose to ourselves. Sustainable development. 100 years ago, the whole world was optimistic. We are even more optimistic today, and I'm a great optimist. But in those days, there was no fear of unsustainability. They never saw conflict between nature and progress. Only about 90 years ago, 100 years ago, they started tapping that ugly, useless thing called oil, which became then the black gold, the liquid gold, which has been shaping the events of the world in the past century, which probably will cause many reverberations in the next quarter century. It's no longer sustainable. Global warming, I think, is now recognized to be a reality. About 99% of the scientific community believes that global warming is a reality. We have gone too far by emissions of carbon dioxide. At the same time, we cannot go back to the world of 150 years ago. That simply is not on. Whether we like it or not, we want this world. We want all the goodies of this world. But happily, it is compatible with nature. It is possible. And the answer lies in the sun and the plant. The sun's energy is tapped by the plants, and for millions of years, these plants perfected that art through photosynthesis. And after all, even the oil is a product of photosynthesis. As we all know, the oil today is nothing but the remnants of the plant life of millions of years ago. But instead of burning it and adding to the carbon dioxide load, we need to tap the carbon dioxide through photosynthesis and then burn it so that at least the current level of CO2 can be maintained. And we have the technology, we have the means. But do we care enough to do that? Because if we don't do it in the next quarter century, I have no doubt in my mind that our children won't have a future to speak about. And we are lucky because we can address this problem. It's not a problem without a solution. It's a problem where the solution is staring us. Brazil has already shown that 40% of all fuel used in their automobiles in Brazil is now ethanol produced from sugarcane. In this country, we produce sugarcane and then sugar, we eat it and get diabetes and get obese. In Brazil, they refuse to make sugar. Almost all sugarcane is diverted to ethanol, which does not go into human consumption like it happens in this country. In this state alone, 5 million families are getting ruined because of alcohol. It doesn't go there. It doesn't go in the form of sugar to cause obesity and diabetes. It goes in the form of fuel. They are serving themselves and all mankind. We can do that and much more. Biofuels is the way of future. Sustainable development. I'm not talking of the grand things, the esoteric things. I'm talking of a simple, practical method by which we can meet our energy needs and yet make it sustainable without adding to global warming. And we have to do it quickly. And the whole society and all education must be restructured around that. Societal harmony. I was reading Father Castellino's paper, and the very first question he raised was a very provocative one. That in this day and age, with technological growth, economic prosperity, we also have created this phenomenal monster of fundamentalism, of violence. Can we learn to live with each other? Or do we have to destroy each other? In the name of religion, in the name of a weapon, in the name of many other artificial differences that we can manufacture at will? Can we live in harmony, reconciling these seemingly conflicting differences? In particular, can we live in harmony, recognizing and respecting each other's faiths or lack of faith, and respecting the humanity in each other, and finding a way of evolving, prospering, and deriving true happiness? Or should there be the inevitable conflict civilizationally? I think that's the central challenge of our age. I think the whole society and education must be structured around these. Confrontation and insight will not take us far. This morning, I was reading after arriving in Vijayawada, the life of Prophet Muhammad. I was trying to understand the events that shaped the world of today, some 14 or 1500 years ago. The religiosity that has such profound impact on human lives. The certainty that comes to many, many people when they have that great faith in God. But that very faith, which has such noble and wonderful qualities, can also lead us astray, because excessive certainty could lead us to a belief that we could do whatever God ordained, or we believed God ordained. God may or may not have ordained. We may misread those words of God, that message of God, and because we are certain about it, we are not beset by doubt and concern and suspicion and questioning. We can wreak havoc in society. And we are now in the midst of such a phase in human history. It happened time and again in all history. But now, it is particularly complex because the world is very delicately balanced. Because human progress is extremely rapid. Because events that took 100 years to evolve can now happen in 3 years, in 2 years, in 1 year. We don't have the time to adjust to the new situation. That's the difference. It's not that we became more venal, more dangerous. It's just that the situation is more explosive today. Because if I selectively bomb something somewhere in the world, I can make a difference to the lives of all 6.5 billion people on all earth. Human beings never had that capability. The vengeance they wreaked, the damage they did was very limited throughout history. Whereas today, if I selectively bomb a few oil fields in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, suddenly in a few weeks' time, I can drive the whole world to an enormous crisis, unimaginable crisis. So do we have the capacity to forgive each other, to learn from each other, to imbibe those teachings for centuries of all those great saints and sages and prophets, to learn to love, to learn to live together? It's no longer a philosophical question. It's a very fundamental question of survival in this generation. Like energy, this probably is the second great question of this generation. If we don't answer this question satisfactorily in the next 20-25 years, I suspect they will be inheritors of the human race 20,000 or 10,000 or 5,000 years later, but there will be a lot more grief than necessary. And I think we are burdened with that challenge today. And the question of justice and order in a society like ours, with increasing urbanization, when social controls are disappearing increasingly. However terrible, the feudal controls had some positive impact on society because human behavior was regulated by social pressures. Once societal pressure disappeared, if the state does not take over, if instruments of public order and justice do not function effectively, then might becomes right. Then justice becomes the private property of the fellows who wield the biggest guns. Rough and ready justice through brutal means becomes the reality. I'm not describing some futuristic scenario. It's already happening in large pockets of India. There's nothing like justice in an orderly manner in this country. Increasingly, justice is nothing but the handiwork of those people who can wield the biggest gun, the biggest stick. If there are no gundas and criminals in our society, we'll actually invent them because there's a market demand for criminals, because they have become the undeclared judges in society. We have to create a just society, not merely in a spiritual sense, not merely in a moral sense, but in a practical sense, in a day-to-day sense. And we have to deal with this whole iniquity. The moral neutrality to iniquity by birth, which is the hallmark of Indian society. That's a different way of talking about this wretched caste system. If we don't address this question, not necessarily merely morally, but from a purely economic and functional standpoint of view, if we do not recognize that the differences by birth are inconsequential, that every child is entitled to fulfill her potential, only then can we all flourish together. Otherwise, we will all perish because of hatred, because of unfulfilled potential. If we don't recognize that, it's already late. But if we don't recognize that, even the economic growth, belated though it is, that we are witnessing now, that's no longer sustainable, let alone that being morally utterly offensive. We have to address this, but from a practical plane, not merely moral plane. Because people understand their self-interest. Our job is to make it enlightened self-interest. I do not believe that the bulk of the people are imbued with a moral purpose. I'm sorry, Father, for being somewhat realistic here. But I believe the bulk of the people are capable of functioning morally by making a very practical calculation of what benefits them and what hurts them. The function of a society, the function of an educational process is to make them realize what is truly in their best interest. If I want my child to go to school, I don't want to send the child to a school where my caste man is teaching just because he's a caste man, unless he's a good teacher. If he's a thoroughly rotten teacher, I will not send my child to that school because my caste man is teaching. Not because I have become moral, but because my child's future is more important to me than my stupid caste. If my wife is under the surgeon's knife, I would not choose the surgeon on the basis of my caste, however casteist I am. I go to the best surgeon who can save her life, unless, of course, I hate her and want to get rid of her. Again, it is my selfishness, my enlightened self-interest that made me recognize that there's something more important than the caste or some other denomination. This practical calculus can be a very important influence to make people behave morally. It's not always morality per se, because I believe it's only a small percentage of human beings that can, without any external pressure or inducement, follow that straight and narrow path. The bulk of the people require a calculus. They require something which they can measure, something that is beneficial. They require enlightened self-interest. And I believe that we can overcome these prejudices if we merely make people understand where their true self-interest lies. And of course, political freedom, decentralization of power, the fight against fundamentalism, the recognition that freedom goes with responsibility, one cannot be divorced from the other. And the importance of not tampering with nature in the name of scientific inquiry. I do not yield place to anybody. I yield to none in my admiration for science. But if my quest for science, I am willing to go towards human cloning, then I think we have gone too far. I think ultimately we will reap a very sad harvest. So even there, even in our scientific quest, I think we must look at ethics not necessarily from a religious point of view, but purely in the sense of long-term survival of the humankind. Is it desirable for us to have a brave new world of cloning? Is it desirable where the human mind is no longer important and the machines can take over? Or should we recognize that there is a limit to the technological innovation, and sometimes our excessive innovation may actually do us harm? I do not know what the answer is. Maybe I'm getting old. Maybe I'm no longer as adventurous as I was 20, 30 years ago. But I do believe that there must be a line somewhere. The line must not be drawn casually or flippantly. It must not be excessively arbitrary. But perhaps you must not tamper with nature too much. Where is that too much is something for each society to make up its mind about. But I think we have to face that question. Again, it's no longer a theoretical question because human cloning is here and now. It's actually possible today. If we don't address this question, we could have problems with our own technology. Finally, I'm a great optimist. I believe the world will get better and better. I believe the challenges of today will be solved tomorrow. There will of course be more challenges. There will never be a world which is perfect. Thank God for that. Because a perfect world will be an extremely boring world. Again, in my more irreverent moments, I say that heaven is an extremely boring place. There's no challenge. You have no needs that are not met. Your resources outstrip your needs. So where is human ingenuity? It's a boring and dull place. But we should not commit the mistakes that our predecessors have committed. And our children should not commit the mistakes that we have committed. They have a right to commit their own mistakes. There will be always mistakes. There will be always problems and challenges in each generation. And there must be new challenges and new problems. And I'm sure the future will be better, but only if we recognize that some of the things that we do in our quest for a better future may actually undermine that very future. But I don't side with the pessimists who believe that things are getting worse. I believe things are getting better. Let me conclude with just one passage. Umberto Eco wrote this book, The Name of the Rose. I don't know how many of you read that book. It was in the 15th century setting, 15th or 16th century setting, in a monastery. The story is not important for us here, but a young man who witnessed certain events over a period of a week or 2 weeks with a master of his, he wrote that book 50 years later. That was the style. So this young man who became old by the time he wrote the book talks about how wonderful the world was at that time, how noble and moral people were, how religious and God-fearing society was, and how rotten things today are 500 years ago. In a span of 50 years, this young man who became old suddenly thought that when he was young, everything was wonderful. By the time he was old, everything was rotten. Passage after passage, 5-6 pages were only about that. If you exclude some of the contextual references, this is the lament of every elderly person in every age, in every society. As we grow old, there's a nostalgia. We lament the bygone days. We think the present is horrible, it's going to get worse. The truth is, The present is much better than the past. The truth is, we live in the best of all possible worlds. The truth is, of course, there are challenges, but we can more than meet those challenges if we have the wisdom. The truth is, the future is going to get better. And I hope that your labors, your commitment will give that wisdom to make our youngsters make the world better, to minimize the dangers, to face the challenges squarely, to act with courage, and as J.J. Holland said, to create tall men. As a male chauvinist, he didn't talk of women, but obviously men and women. Tall men, sun-crowned, who live above the fog in public duty and in private thinking. Thank you very much.
Very inviting talk that you gave us. What comes across to me, you have expressed what so many of us have it inside us as private hopes, private desires. I wish I could, I wish we could, but never dare to express, never dare to make it into something of a reality, never dare to communicate, and therefore it remains private hopes and they die. Whereas what you said, it is possible for people with basic intelligence, commitment to rise up and really build something very different. Since we are in this field of education here, in our institutions, and you know our institutions, you have been one of them, you have some suggestion about where we could, in a practical way, especially with our young, and one of the things that President Kalam very often does is give this kind of energizing to the youth to build a different India, a new India with the capabilities that you have. Would you like to say something about where our curriculum, not just the syllabus, the curriculum of building human persons in our schools and colleges, where could we make a paradigm shift?
Demand by changing the goal, that is what an examination is about. Evaluation, really. I'm going beyond examination, evaluation about. Then the same kids will do different things because they're seeking the same thing on both occasions. They're seeking success. I think we have to redefine success in education in a very formal sense, not merely in a moral sense. That we've been discussing all over, but it doesn't happen. In a formal sense, who is a successful student? Why is it that my son who goes from here to the United States or some other country, goes to a university there, suddenly he flowers as a human being intellectually. Suddenly he is an autonomous human being. He is able to take decisions for himself. He is able to challenge himself and meet fairly rigorous standards. And the same kid here, why is it that in a few days' time he is declining? This is a very practical question, it's not a moral question. I think there's a lot we can do. There are many non-monetary inputs into education that can dramatically alter the nature of outcomes. I think not enough has been done, and I think Jesuits are very well placed to challenge the educational orthodoxies. Father Tekumari was telling me just now that, I think Father Hector was telling me that a Jesuit university is now planned. I'm really glad to hear that. I hope not one, but at least 2 or 3 universities come to cater to each region of this country. And you will set an example that a university degree could be entirely different. Now, initially, people may think this is not very attractive because this is not conforming to their notions of quote-unquote education. But once you prove that these products are worthwhile, not only as fine human beings, but as economic entities, as people who are very productive in whatever field they work, they actually make a difference, suddenly the demand is going to shoot up. I think that challenge these institutions must accept. The second is, how do you bring in problem-solving capacity in education even at early level? How do you make it again a part of the curriculum? The third is, increasingly many of us are worried that 25 years hence, in a world obsessed with technology in a very, very clinical sense, there's no community left. I don't think at the current rate we can assemble a group like this and have a meaningful dialogue, serious discussion. Even the capacity to communicate is now disappearing. We are thinking somehow that communication is language or linguistic skills. Communication is thought. Communication is innovation. Communication is collaboration. Communication is leadership. Communication is productivity, collectively. Communication is the very survival of the community. In a fundamental sense, because communication has failed, we have now the so-called clash of civilizations. Communication is the very essence of human life, particularly collective life. And our educational process in the past 20 years has largely ignored this in the country. That's why we have morons intellectually. They may have IQs in a sterile sense, but intellectual morons who cannot communicate in our country. I think Jesuits must be unafraid of focusing on communication. It's not an old-fashioned thing. I think it's an absolutely vital thing in the modern world. I believe the Jesuits could innovate a great deal. You know all these things, Father. I'm only saying this as a young man who's willing to challenge orthodoxy, more to provoke you into thinking, not to really tell you anything original or new. Any other questions?
You mentioned that 70% of our engineers are without a job now. It is a bit surprising. Okay, at any rate, could you sort of give us the reason, or anybody has analyzed the reason for that? Is it because of they are not really competent, or is it because there are no job opportunities? Thank you.
I have no doubt, Father, the answer is the former. There simply is no wealth-creating capability. There simply are no skills. There are opportunities aplenty in this country, in a growing economy. Right now it's growing at 9.3%. It could actually 10%. The Prime Minister's desire is not a dream. It's actually a dream well within our reach. A 10% growth rate for the next few years, or perhaps even a decade or more, is well within our reach. We need a large number of skilled and competent youngsters in any number of fields in this country. And that's why we have a mechanical engineering who does not know what's under the hood of a car. He's a mechanical engineer. Now, if I want to hire a cook, because I'm not able to get ready the kids for school in time, and if in the morning the homemaker tells her, look, I want you to make the following curries, and she sits in front of a television in a sofa and says, Ma'am Sahib, I cannot cook, but I certainly can taste food. I will watch the television serial. You please cook the food, and I'll eat that and tell you how tasty it is. I don't think we will tolerate that cook very, very long. If I buy a new car, and if I hired a driver because he has a fine driving license, and I asked him to take out the car and take me from here to Hyderabad one fine morning, and he says, look, I'll sit in the back seat. I cannot drive, though I have a license, but I will certainly give you company. I don't think I'll tolerate him for long. Employment is a product of the capacity to fulfill human needs. Wealth creation is the key to employment. Wealth in the form of goods or services, whether it is teaching or healthcare. How come in a country with hundreds of thousands of technology graduates, a good mathematics or physics teacher in Andhra Pradesh now commands a premium price of 200,000 rupees a month? Do you know that? In these MSET coaching centers for medical engineering admission tests, how come in a state where tens of thousands of postgraduate degree holders and PhDs are produced in physics and mathematics, the few that can teach, how come they're commanding 200,000 rupees a month? The supply simply does not match the demand. It's an educational process. Of course, there's going to be some unemployment always, but that's a marginal one. Unemployment here is not that. They are incapable. Whereas a good ITI, a simple ITI, Industrial Training Institute, a good product from there is now commanding a price of 40 to 50,000 rupees some places after a few years. You know that? An engineer does not get 3,000 rupees, an ITI can get 30 to 40,000 rupees a month. The supply is simply not there. And that's why it's a problem that is easy to solve, very easy to solve. But we must recognize it. And we must fight the orthodoxies. Keep at some distance and speak.
In all walks of life, still you prefer to be an optimist. Can you tell us how are you going to translate your optimism into a reality?
You would get a telephone on demand, and you would be able to speak to anybody in the world at a very low tariff, low price. And even the poorest in the villages could actually access telephones and talk to anybody. When we were students here in this college, I remember at the time K.L. Rao, who was a member of parliament from here and a minister from here, he addressed us in this very hall, I remember. And he told us how he could speak to his son living in the United States, and all he did was just dial and then he could speak. And he said, my God, when will it happen in India? Why are we so terrible? Today we can teach the United States a lesson or two. We have much better telephones, believe me. Our telephone technology is far superior to American. We are much less expensive, we are far more economical, because technology has taught us and it's now accessible to everybody. 10 years ago, when I wanted to shift a telephone from one place to another place, I shifted home. It took me 6 months, and even then, my sister-in-law, without my knowledge, I suspect, bribed somebody. She said, look, you're useless, I'll take care of this. I said, please do. Within 48 hours, the phone was shifted. The other day, again I shifted home just last month on the 1st of September. I went on tour, I went back to the new house. I just went out of the old house, I went to the new house. The telephone was already there. It didn't require anybody's fixing anything. Things today are much better than they were earlier. Yes, they're not as good as they should be. Yes, there could be many more things we could do and we should do. That's why there is this anger. Because between potential and fulfillment, there's always a gap. That makes us angry. That's very good. As long as the anger is constructively channelized. But history teaches us that there are answers to our problems, all very simple problems. Let me give one illustration. In the 1860s, one member of parliament wrote a letter to his constituents in Britain. He wrote, you know, and I know, that I bought your constituency in a public auction for £5,000 sterling. You do not know that I know that you already bargained with another gentleman for £8,000 for the next election. That means I will not be your next MP. But what you should know is that I have already bargained with another constituency for £3,000. And both of us again, as you gain £3,000 more, I lose £2,000 less. Both of us again, it's an actual letter which is still preserved in the British archives. Then came Gladstone, the great liberal who became Prime Minister in 1868 for the first time. He was Prime Minister 4 times intermittently over the next 24 years. He understood the nature of crisis plaguing British politics. And he rebuilt institutions in Britain brick by brick. By 1892, when he demitted office finally, the foundations of a new, modern Britain, a proud Britain, were laid. All these are very simple problems, with practical and elegant and sensible solutions. We have the means today, we have the technology today. Do we have the will? That's all the challenge. Take healthcare, and I mean it. I know what I'm speaking about. I'm a medical doctor by training, and I designed the National Health Mission framework for the country. Of course, it's not implemented at all in the spirit it should be. But in 1 year's time, we can guarantee that every single Indian will get free health care at zero cost of decent quality, without having to spend out of pocket, without having to die and suffer. We have the means, we have the capacity today already. Do we institutionalize it or not? That's the challenge. If the elites only want their children to be taken care of and are worried about health only when a dengue-infected mosquito comes and bites my kid and me, and therefore I am in danger, otherwise I couldn't care less. If children die of diarrhea, from which I can save myself, no problem. Then there's no answer. Sometimes I actually get perverse pleasure when the elites suffer. when they recognize the problem of the poor fellow in the slum could be the problem of your own kid in your palace, I think only then they will move. Only then they will recognize that the problems are now indivisible, that we cannot create these islands of prosperity and excellence, that everybody's future is linked with everybody else's. It's only that recognition that's required. It's a societal problem, it's an artificial problem. These are not problems created by nature or God. That's why I'm optimistic. If it's a God-created problem, I give up. Why bother? I can't do anything about it. There's going to be a great volcanic eruption eliminating much of humankind. There's nothing you and I can do about it. We might as well submit ourselves to the will of God if there is one. But these are artificial problems created by us as human beings. That's why I'm optimistic.
In the present scenario, we are running schools. Out of the total number of teachers, around 30 to 40% of the teachers are doing the minimum. And you said we need to restructure our educational policy, therefore we can find some improvement. When we don't get teachers, good teachers to teach children, restructuring of the educational policy will solve the problem? Do you think that it will solve the problem? Unless we have teachers, good teachers to teach children, only restructuring of our educational policy, will it solve our problem?
It's an extremely good question, very practical question. 37 years ago when I came to the portals of this institution, I came from a village school, from a Telugu medium school. And those are the kids that are going to colleges now. Now college is too late because you can't now teach the basics in college and then build that kid. The college teacher says, look, the kid already has come in this way, what can I do? I can't teach the kid now the elements of calculus. I can't teach the kid now the simple principles of physics or mathematics. It's too late. And there are university graduates with mathematics who don't know how to do an LCM, who don't know the meaning of common factor. There are university graduates, Ajit Ranjanekar tells me, of the Wipro Foundation, Triennial Foundation. He tells me that 50 to 60% of university graduates in humanities do not know what 7 multiplied by 0 is. Because the concept of multiplication by 0 was never really allowed to enter their minds. So now we have a very vicious situation. We have to break it somewhere. We can't be helpless. My own belief is many of these kids are learning some useful things, but it's not a rounded education. I have seen a teacher of my daughter's. He was teaching her HCF, and I'm, like many other fathers, a very useless parent. I don't pay attention at all to my daughter's education. If you ask me offhand in which grade she is, I have to think a little bit. But one day I had a few minutes time, so I sat with her and asked her what she was doing. At least I think a year or two ago. She said, Dad, I'm doing highest common factor. Then I gave her a few sums. Each time she committed the same error. There was consistency in the error. So I realized that she was taught badly. When I gave her 14 and 28, she gave me 7 as the HCF. When I gave her 15 and 30, she gave 5 as the HCF. So she was doing highest common prime factor, not highest common factor. Because in factorization, typically, we do the prime factorization. And therefore, the highest one among the prime factors is picked up. I explained to her the difference. In 2 minutes, she picked up. And I left a note for the teacher, again giving an illustration or two, giving the difference. And next day, I got a note back saying, thank you, sir, I'm sorry, I'm mistaken. Now, that teacher was supposed to be a good teacher. He is respected. He was teaching 10th class kids also. My daughter at the time was in 4th grade. It's not because the teacher was bad. The teacher suffered third-rate education in childhood. But despite that, because he struggled and there were some good teachers here and there, he did have some basic knowledge, but not the foundations. We can easily overcome them by a bridge course. I actually believe that teachers at school level must have a course, not humiliating them saying you don't know elementary math or physics, but in a very gentle, in a very nice and diplomatic way. We can have some quick rounding off. Just even 2 weeks would do. Conceptual deficiencies can be overcome in a very tactful way. We don't have to tell them that you fellows after graduation don't know anything. And I believe that's a very low-cost input that can dramatically transform school education. And I believe that language issue must be revisited. I'm a great fan of English language. I think in English. I've become completely corrupted now, though I grew up in Telugu. So I have no opposition to English at all. But I think millions of kids' future is ruined because you are trying to teach them at age 5 or 4 in English, a language they don't understand at all. If you say this paper is on this table or this podium, this kid in English medium typically learns THIS this, paper, 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 ISEs. The whole concept is missing. Each word now the kid has to understand the spelling, the pronunciation, the meaning, and then the concept. By the time a kid who knows the language has learned it in 1 second, where's the chance of this kid ever competing? We are hoodwinking ourselves. The first few years must be in the local language. Slowly but steadily, by 5th grade, you can start becoming bilingual because the basic concepts are already in place. By 7th, 8th grade, you can actually shift towards English. You can use Telugu or Malayalam or whatever language to the extent required so that where the kid is finding it difficult, you can use both the languages. By the time the kid finishes school, you can actually make sure that the kid is proficient in both the languages. There are ways of doing things. So I think there are practical answers. I'm only trying to give 2 answers, the issue of language and how to give some kind of conceptual roundedness to teachers at the school level. Similar principles apply at the college level. You have a system of electives, for instance. In college, 140 years ago, Charles Eliot in Harvard started that. Many great universities do it now. But in India, no university started that. I find it amazing that what's happening in the rest of the world, we're completely oblivious of that. There's no elective system in this country. Who told you that a BSc must be only CBZ or PMC? What is this business? Who told you that? Why can't I choose art appreciation as one course, chemistry as another, mathematics as a third, and accounting as the fourth? Who said knowledge is so divisible? All over the world it's practiced in that way. And then you go to a teacher who is the best, who is the most reputed. You select the teacher. And therefore, the teacher has now a reinforcing mechanism. There's an accountability system. It's not that you're recruited and whether you perform or not, it doesn't matter. Your performance is judged not by somebody else, but by the students who come to you. They vote with their feet. They decide or otherwise your course. As simple as that. You become accountable. You cannot cheat. There are ways, there are very practical ways of operationalizing these principles. We can go on and on. Some of us have done some thinking about higher education, for instance. Even school education, we are looking at some of the issues very deeply. I believe they're very practical answers, but we must give up our orthodoxies. We must be willing to lead, not merely follow like sheep. The parents may sometimes tell us out of their anxiety for their children's future that this is what they want. But there are times when a doctor must tell the patient that you don't know the best always. Now, these are the options, and you must think what is best for your kid. I think we must have that courage. Yes, sir.
Pointed out the issues, the present educational system, and you have proposed also restructuring of the educational system. Perhaps one way I picked up is maybe problem-solving capacity or capacity for communication. If I understand you rightly, perhaps you want the Jesuit institutions, educational institutions to be centers for capacity building. Could you please concretely suggest few steps or areas where we could build up this capacity that would give them a facelift? Thank you.
Community, both at the school and college level, and particularly at the college level, problem-solving capacities. We actually make it part of the project work. An autonomous institution, if it can design its own examination system, you give 40 or 50% grading on the basis of this interaction with the community. It may be in political science or sociology. You go to the old city, one town or something here, deal with the Muslim and Hindu and Christian population and see what are the interrelationships and what are the prejudices and what are the good features there. That may well be a part of the study. And give it a sufficient grade. Give it a significant importance. Make it a target. redefine success. Therefore, problem solving, interface with the community, and examination must be together. You can't separate them. And bring in a large element of practical content in curriculum work. For instance, nowadays in intermediate in Andhra Pradesh, kids don't even go to a laboratory to get 95% in intermediate. And they get 95%. Kids take Sanskrit or French, they don't know a sentence of Sanskrit or French, they can't understand or speak one sentence. They get 90% plus. And we call it education. It doesn't require genius to change that. We can completely reorient it. In higher education, as I said, the system of electives, the system of choosing teachers, for instance. You know, in all the great universities of the world, there's one simple rule of thumb, that an alumnus of a university shall not be a teacher in the same university, because you require cross-fertilization of ideas. A Harvard product can go to Stanford, a Stanford product can go to Yale, but not to the same university. In exceptional cases, after 20 years, if that person becomes the best in the field in the world, there's nobody to match, then occasionally that person may go back to that university. But these are exceptions for the best in the world. Otherwise, even the university first shall not go to that university as a teacher. It's an absolute rule followed in all these universities. It doesn't cost a single rupee. Force people in higher education to mingle, to go outside their milieu, and encourage youngsters to challenge orthodoxies. So there are many, many methods. Some of them are regulatory. I don't understand why the UGC exists. It's a disgrace. This whole aided system today stinks. Aid is only for certain posts, not block grant, and courses that are totally unpopular, that outlive their utility, their aid is available. And elsewhere where the probably person is much more qualified, and that person works at 1/4 of the wage, and the college has no choice. You can convert it into a block grant to the college, continue the aid, in fact increase that, but give flexibility as long as the courses are much more sensible and the outcomes are satisfactory. So both at the regulatory and state level and at the institutions level, there are many, many innovations possible. I did not center my talk around education. The thing given to me is how to build society. But because we're looking at education as a tool to make that societal building possible, I addressed one or two elements there. But certainly there's a lot to be discussed and studied and improved. And our own website contains some elements of that.
Education now. You're talking about education examination system and so on. While you're talking about enhancing freedom, and you're talking about 2 points, political freedom and intellectual freedom. And I'm sure that most of us are here, that we are very much involved in imparting intellectual freedom. But I have a few things to think aloud with my companions here, that I think we are very much behind in doing something in enhancing the political freedom in our institutions. I quite agree, I'm convinced, and you will agree with me when I say that politics in itself is not bad. They are very much part and parcel of our life, and for the development of our country here, we need politics. And we are very much working at that field now. We are happy that you are in it now. I think most of our institutions do not concentrate on this aspect. I don't know, we are afraid that we will get into problems. Or I think I always felt we should be able to educate and encourage our own students in thinking in those aspects, maybe through movements, different movements. I may not join a Congress party. I may not join a TDP party. Maybe can I join a movement? So can you give some input how, as Jesuit education is, can we encourage and impart our thoughts in political area? Thank you.
It's about prioritizing your resources, because there's always this clash between limited resources and unlimited wants in society. It's the function of politics to prioritize and to reconcile these seemingly irreconcilable things. So without true politics, a society would both lose freedom and prosperity. So I have no doubt about that. The reason why we are somehow shy of talking of politics is that somehow politics is seen to be an immoral endeavor in this country. And increasingly it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Therefore, I think at one level, the larger debate on what politics is about, I think is a starting point, without going into this party, that party. And that's a perfectly legitimate question that we should raise. It's a citizenship question. It's about the constitutional values. What is politics about? What ought to be politics? And what is politics currently? And what is the gulf and how to bridge that? I think that could be an important question for inquiry and for instruction. The second reason why there's fear of politics in universities is a fear of partisanship. Now, if we take politics as a partisanship, and if we go into the larger questions of educational reform, it is a political question. How do you reform education is a political question. How do you ensure that kids of underprivileged families get an opportunity is a large political and constitutional question. Whether reservations or no reservations, whether creamy layer or no creamy layer, these are not some esoteric issues. These are fundamental questions. These are political questions. There must be honest debates, and there must be discussion, there must be evidence, there must be research and discovery. How to ensure health care? It is an issue of politics. You cannot have health care in the world without politics. How to treat a patient is an issue of technology. These are two different questions. If somebody comes to me with a cerebral malaria, what treatment I give, in what stage, is a technical question. But what kind of a healthcare system do I design to guarantee access to everybody is not merely a technical question. Those are technical inputs are required. It is a political question. Somehow the word politics must be redefined. And if kids don't understand at college level these fundamental issues and the link with politics, and what's happening in, let's say, Britain, for instance, or the United States, transport, it's a political question. What kind of transport choices do we make as a society? It's a political question. The model of urbanization that we promote, agricultural value addition, it's an economic and political question. So in other words, there is politics that can be taught, that can be imbibed without talking of politics in a partisan, ugly sense, in an electoral sense. But even in an electoral sense, without talking about this party or that party, how many youngsters, or I dare say even how many of us here in this room, know how to register yourself as a voter? If I asked you, let alone registering yourself as a voter, but if I asked you to find out whether your name exists in the electoral rolls or not, I have a nagging suspicion that half of you would not know how to go about it. You just would not know what to do next. If the task is a simple one, you, sister, should find out whether your name is there in the electoral rolls or not. You're a citizen of this country, you're above 18 years of age, you're ordinarily resident at this place, you're entitled to be a voter. Are you a voter or not? It is, of course, a political question. It's not a partisan question. It can be part of the curriculum. You can actually make it into a challenging experiment. You can ask them to find out about themselves, and you can ask them to find out about their neighbors, and go to a particular ward or area and find out how many people are enrolled, how many are not enrolled, and why there are flaws. And if they were to design a system of registration of voters in a better way, what would they do? To me, it's an exciting question. It's a stimulating question. It's a political question. It's also a transformational question. So you can go on and on. You can bring in politics into academia without, quote unquote, politicizing in an ugly way. All these are political. It depends on the way you look at politics. It depends on the way we understand the meaning of politics. I find it utterly shameful that no university political science faculty ever thought fit to do a PhD on voter registration, or on the party's funding pattern, or on the disclosure that they made about the funds they've raised, or the monies they actually spend in the constituencies. If those are not debated in politics in universities, if you merely talk about what is the meaning of state, what are the four elements of state, territory, population, government, and sovereignty, what is the meaning of sovereignty? Third-rate definitional education, pardon me for saying so. We call it university education. This is education. What I'm talking about is education. And that's how it is studied everywhere in the world. That's how we create problem solvers. Have you ever heard in this country a serious discussion at the national level or state level of problem solving in any of these areas? From voter registration to healthcare improvement? Why? Because the educational structure has failed. We never understood what politics really is. I'm sorry for being extremely judgmental. I'm not judgmental usually. But to save time, I'm making some very harsh statements. But I think the first point of departure is to understand where we have gone wrong. Only then we can set things right. But I can think of 100 questions that can be addressed in our universities by our students that make them politically aware without being politically participative in a partisan sense. And once you do that, the interest you kindle will make them automatically join movements. You don't have to tell them. They'll choose. I can tell you now in Andhra Pradesh, 75 to 80% of all young people are with Lok Satta Movement. So if young people join politics, I don't have to ask for their vote. I know their vote is for me. All I have to do is make sure that they go to vote, that's all. So they will make the moral choices because youth in any generation always looks for a moral improvement. That is the very nature of the youth. There is that idealism. There is a burning desire to improve things. So they will find their own feet. I don't want to worry. But have we given them the tools? Have they understood? That is what universities can do. I mean, I would love to design a course for the universities. Whatever be the course they are doing, it doesn't have to be a political science course. How to engage the youngsters politically without being partisan. I think they can do a brilliant job. There's so much to be done at zero cost because the whole society is a laboratory. You don't require money for equipment. And it can be fun. It can be great fun. There are many ways of doing that. I entirely agree with you. I'm one of those unprivileged persons who could not find that source yet. I'm an agnostic. There's still hope. But in some ways, the first part of my presentation indicates the source of my energy. I have tried to make a discovery for myself of what I believe matters in life, what is life about. And I have tried to develop my own concept of sin. And I am a very privileged youngster in this country who, despite an unprivileged background, got the best of everything. I could grow in that village 15 kilometers from here, a village where there was not a single newspaper available, where even if you wanted, you didn't know how to read books, what books there were nothing left except a few very rudimentary textbooks, where there was no electricity at home, and yet we walked into this college. I had the temerity to go to the then principal, Father Worky, and say, Father, those days there was some debate about English medium versus Telugu medium. For the first time, there was a Telugu medium introduced in colleges. So there was some talk that those who came from Telugu medium must go only to Telugu medium colleges. And I believed, like everybody else, that if I didn't go to English medium college, then I would have a difficulty later on, therefore I have to go there. And I believed that I earned that right because I thought, reasonably okay. And I simply went to the principal and said, Father, if you don't give me a seat in English medium here, I will not join your college. And the principal, instead of throwing me out of the room, he simply said, will you give me your marks list? He had seen that and he said, my son, if you don't get a seat, who else will? They were so kind and compassionate. They gave us confidence. And I could walk into a medical school from here. But today when I go back and see the youngsters in that school, in that village, 15 kilometers from here, 99 out of 100 of them have no chance of getting into an institution like this. Probably 100 of 100 would never enter a medical school on their own. No chance at all. Instead of things getting better, their potential is completely stunted. That makes me very angry. I channelize that anger. Unfulfilled potential makes me terribly angry because that need not be there. Avoidable suffering makes me extremely agonized because that is unnecessary. We can overcome that. And it's that sense of philosophy of life which all of us have to discover in our own way. And this sense of anger channelized constructively, I think that should give energy to many of us. So there is hope for those of us who don't necessarily have faith in God. Father, let me kindly intelligent minds imbued with a moral purpose, with years of experience, intense experience in the field of education. But the questions that we discussed today are, I believe, very central. They cannot be merely academic questions. They are the questions that determine the very survival of our society. And perhaps, in some senses, without being melodramatic, the survival of the human race itself. But I believe that we have the answers. Most of the problems that we have today are problems for which answers have been already found. We are very lucky. We live in the best of all possible worlds in 2006. I would never like to exchange this for a 19th century or 18th century world. Because we are in an exciting era. We have so many possibilities. We have so many answers. And of course, some questions will always be there forever. Otherwise, life will be somewhat dull. And most problems can be easily solved now. But they cannot be solved by serendipity alone. We have to design institutions. Mere accidents of fate cannot determine our future. That's not the purpose of education. Education is to organize society. Education is to make this process of discovery much less random and much more predictable, much more certain. Education is the process by which the thoughts of the few will go to benefit the many. Not through the accident or hard work of a few people who learn at the master's feet, but the bulk of the people who may have never understood what an Einstein said, or what a Newton did, or a Lincoln did, but they still get the benefits of that. That's the education. The process of education is the one that actually makes those fruits available to everybody. And I believe that we are lucky in this country, because despite the many mistakes we have committed, we have many strengths in our society. There are, of course, many formidable mistakes we committed, but we have also great strengths in our society. Because in our society, there's still a lot of contentment. There's a lot of happiness despite a lot of poverty. There are social pressures and peer pressure which keep us on the straight and narrow path. It's not the forces of law and order that is making our society behave. If we have to depend only on policemen, we'll have murders galore in India. And yet we are one of the least criminalized societies in the world, despite our phenomenal problems. There is a sense of dharma in a non-religious sense, a sense of what is right and what is wrong, pervading our society. The bulk of the people are fundamentally moral here. Reader's Digest conducted an interesting experiment in several countries some years ago. They put some money in small pouches, some equivalent money. Temptation value is equal or equivalent. And then they put an address to which the finder can return this pouch. And they left these in hostels, hospitals, marketplaces, shop floors, roads, offices, schools, colleges, everywhere. 85% of the Indians, they returned to the address. 85%. There is absolutely no reason to believe that Indian people are immoral. Yes, the people in positions of authority are betraying the Indian people at large. Yes, power has been equated with pelf and privilege. Yes, public office is increasingly a source of private gain. But that's because there are no instruments of accountability. That's because we've perverted politics. That's because power has become private property. But the bulk of the people are victims, they're not villains. And even the villains are as often victims as they are villains. You go and ask Dr. Manmohan Singh, a man of unimpeachable personal integrity. He will tell you how much he is victimized, how much he finds it difficult to change things despite his undoubted intentions and great capacity. You go to a man like A.K. Antony, who for 40 years did not make a single pay personally. He will tell you how he was thrown out only because he was trying to do the right things in Kerala state as chief minister. How he paid a price and how he is paying a price. And many like him in every party are paying a price. There's not that much villainy as we believe. Most of our politicians themselves are victims of a vicious cycle. And the bulk of the people are actually victims, and there's not an ounce of villainy in them. There's not a trace of villainy in them. We have hope because we live in this day and age. If two things the youngsters of our country understand, that there is no room for cynicism and despair, that we have every reason to be optimistic, and two, that there are simple, practical, effective, sensible solutions to most human predicaments, that we are lucky to live in this time and age, and we can translate them into reality if only we learn how to improvise. Even most of the innovation required in the place, we only have to improvise really. Maybe a bit more innovation is required. But if even that we don't do, then the purpose of education is lost completely. After all, the purpose of education is to translate the learning of a few people to the bulk of humanity in order to affect their lives. If their lives are not affected, my scholarship, in a very pedantic sense, is of no consequence to my fellow human beings. I have no great respect for such scholarship. I believe all our learning is about making the human condition better, more happy, more tolerable. And you, the great educationists of the Jesuit spectrum, have done a remarkable job. It is these institutions that shape the destinies of tens of thousands of men and women in this country. And we are all proud products of these institutions. But we are now at crossroads. We need to fundamentally change the nature of education. There has never been greater demand for good education in this country. There has never been worse supply than today. As the demand is increasing, the supply is getting worse. The quantity may be getting more, but the quality is declining precipitously. But happily we can change that, and I believe you must be in the vanguard of this movement. And I believe it's one of the central challenges of today. Even healthcare, I know we can address that instantly, because the people understand the value of it. Even the poorest Indian is not willing to tolerate and sit on the sidelines when her child's life is hanging in balance. And therefore, if you go and explain to that mother how a different healthcare system is going to benefit her family, she's going to fight for that with her life if necessary. But education is a more complex process. It's not only long drawn out, but incentives are not so clear. Every family wants the child to be educated. But even I, if I notice that my child is not doing very well, even I as a lazy human being think, all right, there's always next month. Nothing precipitous is going to happen if there's a delay. There's no sense of imminence, there's no sense of urgency, as opposed to healthcare. And that is why educators have a greater responsibility. They have a greater obligation, because the society needs it. Society demands it. It does not know what is good education. The society does not sit up and fight instantly, unlike in healthcare. And by the time the society is willing to stand up and recognize what is wrong, the child's future is already ruined. And therefore, education is actually a harder question than healthcare. But please believe me, and I know you know, there is huge demand. I still remember one of the things that whenever I think of it, it makes me shed tears even now. 26 years ago, 25 years ago, when I was a young subdivisional magistrate in a district in the north coast of Andhra, I still remember a very poor Dalit employee in a hospital. She was a hospital toti, an illiterate person. She came, fell on my feet with one request. I think her son died or something. She was taking care of the grandchild. She wanted the grandchild to go to a missionary school, a private school in a place called Pedaboddepalli, very close to my sub-collector's bungalow. She was willing to pay the tuition fee. She was a proud woman. She had ambitions for her grandchild. And she had no confidence whatsoever in 25 years ago that her grandchild would get good education in the government school. And with tears streaming down her cheeks, she fell on my feet and asked me to somehow use my influence, use my good offices to get her grandchild admission in that missionary school. I sobbed uncontrollably that day. When I think of it, it's very difficult for me to control my tears even today. No child, no parent in this country should ever have to shed a tear only to get the child's potential fulfilled. It's a sinful society if those mothers and grandmothers have to shed copious tears only in order to get their children educated in the 21st century. And if even after those children go to those schools at great expense for them, believe me. If they don't get education, then that society is a rotten one. And all of us in that society are sinners. We have the glorious good fortune of being able to overcome this sin pretty easily. You have done a great job over the years. I can only say you have a greater responsibility to redefine education, to transform the nature of education, and thereby to redesign society, and to build a truly worthy future for our children. I have no doubt you will do what you have done so gloriously in the past. In the future also you'll do that. Once again, I salute you for your commitment and for your passion and compassion. And I hope, and I'm sure, your labors will bear fruit in the coming years. Thank you very much.
It is very kind of you to be amidst us, to be a source of inspiration, which we would like to spread far and wide, to bring about survival, harmony. That you are one of our ex-students, doing socially well for the city, a symbol of a challenging, optimistic personality for the others to achieve a realistic future. A big thank you.
ఉద్యమంగా ఉన్నప్పుడు ఉద్యమాలు ఎప్పుడు కూడా అందులో మనం ఏదో ప్రొట్టేస్తాం బియ్యం ఇస్తాం అంటున్నారు కాబట్టి ఉద్యమాలు ఎప్పుడు కూడా ఆలోచించేవాడు అంటారు. అప్పుడు మీరు అన్నట్టుగా అందరికీ అర్థం కావాలి. రాజకీయ పార్టీ నడవలసింది, పోషించవలసింది, ఓటు వేయవలసింది, తప్పు చేస్తే శిక్షించవలసింది సామాన్య ప్రజలు. దానికి 3 ప్రధానమైన పద్ధతులు. మొట్టమొదటిది ఈ ఎలివేషన్ బాగా అత్యధిక ప్రచారం యుగంలో